Okay, stop. Before you skip ahead, I need you to understand something. This is not a boring video about dusty classrooms and ancient chalkboards. This is actually one of the most genuinely wild rabbit holes in all of human history. And the fact that nobody talks about it is exactly the problem. Because here's the thing. Every single civilization that has ever existed had to figure out the same terrifying question. How do you take a small, chaotic, feral human child and turn them into someone who knows things? We're talking about education. Not the modern version with its standardized tests and color-coded folders and guidance counselors. The real original version. 3,000 years ago, and the answers, depending on where you were born, were either fascinating, brutal, surprisingly sophisticated, or completely unhinged. Sometimes all four at once. So we're going back. Ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, China, Rome. We're going everywhere, and we're going to find out exactly what children learned, who taught them, what happened if they got it wrong, and honestly, some of the absolutely wild things ancient educators believed about the child brain that will make you question everything. Let's go. First, let's establish something important. Formal education, as a concept, is not a modern invention. Shocker, I know. But you'd be surprised how many people assume that school is a relatively recent development, like electricity or arguing on the internet. It is not. The earliest evidence of structured, intentional teaching goes back to at least 2500 BCE in Mesopotamia, and probably earlier than that. The Sumerians had actual schools, buildings, teachers, curriculum, clay tablets with homework assignments that still survive. We have the homework from 4,000 years ago. And some of it is terrible in exactly the way you'd expect. The universal student experience of not wanting to do your assignment, it turns out, is ancient. Very comforting, honestly. Let's start in Mesopotamia because Mesopotamia deserves more credit than it gets. These are the people who invented writing, which automatically makes education both possible and necessary, because now there's something to actually learn. Sumerian schools were called edubba, which translates roughly to tablet house, and that name tells you everything. The medium of instruction was clay. Students would take a wet clay tablet, a stylus made from a cut reed, and press wedge-shaped marks into the surface in the writing system we now call cuneiform. It sounds slow. It was slow. But it worked, and we know it worked because thousands of student tablets have survived in the archaeological record, including one tablet where a student wrote out the same sign incorrectly over and over, and you can practically see the teacher's frustration radiating off the artifact from across millennia. Who went to these schools? Here's where it gets complicated. And this is a problem that runs through every civilization we're going to look at today. Access to education was not equal, not remotely. In Mesopotamia, students at the edubba were almost entirely boys from elite families, the sons of scribes, priests, merchants, government officials. The curriculum was designed to produce scribes, which in the ancient world was essentially a licensed professional class. Scribes ran the economy. They drafted contracts, recorded grain inventories, wrote laws, corresponded with kings. Learning to write wasn't an intellectual hobby. It was vocational training for one of the most powerful jobs in the ancient world. Girls were largely excluded from formal scribal education, with some exceptions. Evidence exists of female scribes in certain periods of Mesopotamian history, which is genuinely remarkable, given the overall picture. But they were rare enough to be notable. Now, Egypt. Egypt, as usual, is doing interesting things while everyone else is still figuring out the basics. Egyptian education follows a similar pattern to Mesopotamia in some ways. Elite boys learn to write, initially in hieroglyphics, and later in a simplified script called hieratic, which was the practical everyday version. Schools were often attached to temples, making priests both the teachers and the curriculum designers. And the Egyptians had thoughts about what a good student looked like. Specifically, they had a text called the Satire of the Trades, written around 2000 BCE, which is essentially an ancient piece of propaganda designed to convince young men that being a scribe was better than every other possible job. The farmer has it rough, the soldier suffers, the weaver crow, uses all day, but the scribe? The scribe sits in comfort and gives orders. It's a recruitment brochure in papyrus form. Brilliant marketing, honestly. Egyptian students copied texts over and over. Repetition was the entire pedagogical philosophy. You wrote the same passage 50 times until it lived in your hand and your memory simultaneously. The texts they copied weren't random. They included moral instructions, historical records, mathematical problems, medical knowledge, and poetry. So you were memorizing content while also learning to write. Efficient. 2 birds, 1 reed stylus. Corporal punishment was openly discussed in Egyptian educational philosophy, and not in an ambiguous way. One famous Egyptian text essentially states that a boy's ears are on his back and that he listens when he is beaten. That's a direct quote, more or less. Very on brand for a civilization that was otherwise remarkably sophisticated about medicine and engineering. Let's talk about China, because China around 3,000 years ago is sitting in the Zhou Dynasty period, and they were doing something genuinely interesting with education. The Zhou period, roughly 1046 to 256 BCE, is when Confucius eventually emerges, and Confucian educational philosophy becomes so foundational to Chinese culture that it echoes all the way to the present. But even before Confucius formalized the ideas, Zhou education was structured around what they called the 6 arts: ritual, music, archery, chariot driving, calligraphy, mathematics. Stop and think about that list for a second. These are the 6 things an educated Zhou nobleman was expected to master. It's not purely academic, it's not purely physical. It's an integrated curriculum that treats the human being as something that needs to be developed in every dimension simultaneously. Archery and chariot driving alongside calligraphy and ritual knowledge. That's a more holistic approach to education than most of the ancient world managed. Who got this education? Again, the answer is complicated. Zhou education at its highest levels was reserved for the aristocratic class, the nobility. Their sons were educated in preparation for government service and military leadership. But the Zhou period is also when we start to see early arguments for wider access to learning. Confucius himself, operating at the tail end of this period, was famous for accepting students regardless of their social background, asking only for a modest symbolic gift rather than large fees. He taught anyone who wanted to learn. That was radical. Not universally radical, not immediately world-changing, but genuinely radical for its time and place. Ancient Greece is where Western education mythology gets built. And like most mythology, the reality is more complicated than the legend. Athens gets all the credit. Everyone knows about Athens, Socrates, Plato, the philosophical tradition. But before we get there, we need to talk about Sparta, because Sparta's approach to education is one of the most extreme state-controlled systems in recorded history, and it deserves a proper look. Spartan boys entered the agoge, a state educational system, at age 7. Not their family's educational system, the state's. They were taken from their homes. That's the foundation. From 7 years old, they were raised in a communal barrack system designed to produce soldiers. The curriculum was exercise, military drill, pain tolerance, and survival. Students were deliberately underfed and encouraged to steal food, not because the state couldn't afford to feed them, but because the act of stealing without getting caught was considered a valuable skill. If you got caught, you were punished, but not for stealing, for getting caught. That distinction tells you everything about what Sparta valued. Athens operated on an entirely different philosophy. Athenian boys from wealthy families typically had a pedagogos, a household slave whose entire job was to escort the boy to school and supervise his education and behavior. The word pedagogy, the entire field of educational theory, comes from this institution. It comes from a slave's job title. Worth sitting with that for a moment. Athenian education combined physical training at the gymnasium with academic instruction in reading, writing, music, and mathematics. Music was taken seriously as an intellectual and moral subject, not an extracurricular. Playing the lyre was considered essential to a gentleman's formation. Girls in Athens received education at home, if they received it at all, which most of them barely did. The philosophical tradition that produced some of the greatest thinkers in Western history was almost entirely built by and for men. Rome absorbed Greek educational ideas and adapted them with Roman practicality, which is very on brand. Roman boys from elite families were educated first at home, then in small schools run by a teacher called a grammaticus. The curriculum was literature, rhetoric, and eventually philosophy. But Rome added an emphasis on rhetoric that was specifically political. In a Roman republic and later an empire, being able to speak persuasively in public was a core civic skill. Legal cases, political debates, military addresses, the educated Roman male was expected to speak well and speak publicly. Roman education was aggressively focused on producing useful citizens, not just learned ones. Cicero, one of the most famous products of Roman education, wrote extensively about what proper training in rhetoric looked like, and his ideas shaped European education for centuries. For poor children across all of these civilizations, the picture is much simpler and much harder. They learned by working. A farmer's son learned farming by doing it. A potter's child learned pottery by watching and then by doing. A merchant's daughter learned the practical mathematics of trade through direct participation in the family business. Apprenticeship wasn't a program. It was life. You stood next to the adult who knew things, and you absorbed knowledge through proximity and repetition and consequences. Nobody wrote down what these children learned, because nobody was writing anything down for people in this class in the first place. which means our records are skewed, heavily skewed. Almost everything we know about ancient education comes from the sources produced by educated elites, about educated elites.